Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this regularly scheduled meeting of the Public Safety and Emergency Management Committee. Today is May 17th, 2018, and I am joined by Council Members Jeremiah Ellison, Councilmember Steve Fletcher, Councilmember Philippe Cunningham, and Councilmember Lene Palmisano. So we have quorum today, and we are ready to conduct the business of this committee. On our agenda today, we have 7 items. On consent, we have 4 items, and I will be reading the ones that we will keep on consent, and we will be moving one for a brief discussion. So item number 1 is a gift acceptance from Kelly Doran to supply Minneapolis 911 response officers with Narcan. Item number 2 is an MOU with Summit Academy regarding cooperation in addressing campus sexual assaults. Number 3 is a contract with the University of Minnesota Veterinary Medical Center for Police K-9 Health Services. And we are moving number 4, which is a contract amendment with SMG to reduce the hourly rate for 911 dispatchers to discussion. So on the consent agenda, which includes the 3 items, all those in favor, please say aye of accepting this consent agenda items. Aye. Opposed? So those items move forward. So for our first discussion item, we just wanted to have a brief conversation about this change that needs to happen on the 911 dispatchers contract. So I'm wondering if anyone here could just help answer a quick question. As council members, we just wanted to make sure that this was actually not a reduction of pay for our employees, but that we're actually just correcting a previous typo that was approved by our committee. And so we just wanted to clarify that and just kind of contextualize that change for us.
Sure. Chair Cano, thank you very much. The dispatchers are on this contract. We just combined it for ease to have everything on one contract. The dispatcher rate has been $65 right along, and we incorrectly put it at the higher rate of our rate at $105. So this is not a reduction in rate. This is purely a correction of our error in putting it in the contract.
Thank you for that clarification. And I want to note that we have been joined by Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins. Welcome. And I wonder if any of my colleagues want to speak on this item. Councilmember Ellison.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. I think I initially wanted to flag the item because we as a council want to make sure that we're treating workers fairly, and I was like, wait, are we reducing someone's pay? So it's great to have that clarification to make sure that we're not doing that. And I know that in the wording, it uses the word reduce, so I'd love for us to change the wording from reduce to correct, as to not cause any confusion about whether or not we're actually cutting someone's hourly wage.
Yeah, we can definitely change it. And in fact, that message did come up during our Ways and Means agenda setting meeting this morning, and I believe it was changed there. So I will have to ask for some clarification on how we go about doing that. So maybe if I can work with one of you later, and we can talk about that. Yeah,
well, maybe I could just make a motion to amend it and make a motion to amend the wording to change the word from reduce to correct. So yeah, I will make that motion.
Okay, we have a motion before us to switch the terminology on this. Are there any questions on the amendment or the motion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That passes. Thank you very much for taking our question on that. The next item is a discussion item, again, on the Homeless and Vulnerable Populations Initiative. And if we could please have our staff members join us and walk us through this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I appreciate being here. I'm Sgt Grant Snyder with the Minneapolis Police Department. I've stood before this committee a number of times over the past years because of our work on sex trafficking. As of April 1st of this year, I was formally transferred to work with our Homelessness and Vulnerable Populations Initiative. That was the culmination of well over a year conversation with Chief Arredondo about what we were going to be doing, how we had sort of conceptualized how we would, as a police department, better serve our communities that were experiencing homelessness and other forms of vulnerability. And I provide this presentation just sort of give you a core structure of what that looks like now and sort of where we're moving forward. There we go. Okay, so the initial structure per conversations that I had with Chief Arredondo, was to really focus on three separate things: understanding, advocacy, and action. Understanding is a word that I would probably substitute data for, because for the previous, prior to being transferred to April 1st, for the previous 4 or 5 months, I'd been really sort of teasing out as much data as I could, talking to Wilder, talking to Hennepin County, looking at some national level data sets and things like that to really get a better picture of what our population that is experiencing homelessness and other vulnerable populations are going through, and what sort of police service and city services and things like that really look like, and how it's conceptualized. A couple of different aspects and philosophy, sort of foundational ideas, have gone into structuring this prong of our approach. One is sort of that combined experience and observation. Obviously, we get information both anecdotally and empirically, and I wanted to make sure that both of those were represented. We can get so buried in statistics, and if we're not having the opportunity to really spend time with people and individuals and get a feel for what they're experiencing out on the street, and just their interactions with law enforcement and public health and everybody, we can miss that. Another piece of this is engagement of informed and involved partners. What did our partners have to say about it? I really highlighted the idea of situational expertise. I prefer the idea of compartmentalized expertise, which means that each and every person, depending on how they lens this particular issue and what their experiences, brings something of value to it. And I don't really know why I chose situational over compartmentalized, but I did for the purposes of this presentation. We also knew that we wanted to make sure that we were including both governmental and non-governmental sources and providing both governmental and non-governmental access to that. Because if we create a method to be able to sort of measure what's going on, identify what those important data points are and collect those, we want to make sure that that informs people across a broad variety of disciplines and not just talking to, government organizations or city departments. And then making sure that that information is relevant, timely, and informative. There's been a number of initial projects. Oops, I didn't put that up. I apologize for you guys. Please forgive me. I'm so used to doing sex trafficking that I can walk right through, but this is a little more challenging for me. The initial projects that we have focused on already, first of all, I sat down initially and started looking at all the different incident reports from different shelters, Hope Harbor, 1010 Curry, some of the ramps and things like that where people are actually having a high level of interaction, some of the hotels downtown, just to name a few of those. And it's not just isolated in downtown, but all across our city. And I wanted to make sure that we were including those experiences, and it's been very illuminating to this point. And then, of course, identifying the pieces of information that are coming in through tips to 311, tappers, and other places that we would be collecting that data. As part of that whole process, one of the initial things that came out was this idea that we've got all this data that comes in, but there really has not been a good tracking format. And so one of the first things that I proposed was that we create a database, and I proposed using a SharePoint database, primarily because I understand SharePoint, and it would allow us to be able to have a place where at any given time, people could go back and they could understand what the past 6 months looked like, what the past year looked like, and we could get as specific as talking about a particular area, a particular encampment, or something like that. So it just gives us a much better way of sort of coordinating that data and understanding what that data tells us. The second prong of our approach is advocacy, and I have to tell you that just coming out of sex trafficking, this is really where I got more excited than any other piece of this. I love data, but I also really, really love connection. And for me, one of the things that I talked to the chief about originally, and when I asked him to transfer me into this, is can I do this as a relational exercise? And he's allowing me to do that. And so I've spent probably 70% of my time already in relationship and building relationship with folks from all aspects of our community, people that are serving the homeless and vulnerable populations, people that are experiencing homelessness in some form of vulnerability and things like that. And we wanted to make sure that not only were we having an embedded approach where it's not that 1,000-yard view where you're driving by in a squad car and you're waving at people or getting out and having a street corner conversation. Those are fine to a certain extent, but you don't build relationship like that. You build relationship by having frequent communication, frequent interaction over a variety of different circumstances. When people are happy, when they're sad, when they're hungry, when they're not, when they're experiencing distress, and when they're pretty level-headed. And so that sort of initiative or that conviction that I have about meeting people on any given day where they are is one of our guiding principles around this.
Mr. Snyder, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we have a question or comment from Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Wanted to, thanks for this so far. I wanted to take a quick step back, and I know that you have experience with commercial sexual exploitation work. I'm curious, do you have a background in social work, or is there somebody who has helped create this program foundationally from a social work perspective?
So, Madam Chair, Councilmember Cunningham, thank you for the question. And please, Madam Chair, don't feel bad about interrupting me at any point. I talk kind of quickly and I get lost in my words here. So thank you for the question. I don't have a background in social work. I've studied social work. I have one master's degree, and I'll be finished with my other master's degree. I do a variety of outreach projects and have done so for about the last 20 years. My background is in advocacy and interaction with victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault, owing way back to before I was ever a cop. And so I have a history of working closely with social workers. Most of what we did and most of what I learned around sex trafficking and how we interacted with victims was at the tolerance and the good advice of people that worked in and of those communities. And you get a really different vibe depending on what people's experience, if they're a clinical social worker versus if they're a street level social worker and things like that. Part of the initial setup of this and what this sort of framework grew out of was meetings. When the chief first told me he was interested in this, the first 30 days were a flurry of interactions with people, street level advocates from Streetworks, from St. Stephen's, from YouthLink, from all the other agencies and organizations that serve that population. I've been sort of adopted by YouthLink as a partner, and they're willing to bring me in and actually allow us to have office space there for office hours and things. So I feel pretty confident that, and they also know me, and they know that they can come to me anytime and go, hey, you're on the wrong track, do this, and they know that I'll take their advice with that. So I wish I could say, yes, I'm a social worker, because I know you'd like to hear that, but unfortunately I'm not. So
No, I just didn't know if you had a background in it before you got into policing, so that's why I was asking. But no, thank you for that. And the reason why I ask is because, when I first saw that there is a homeless initiative coming out of the police department, it's definitely important to make sure that we're anchoring it from the perspective of social work and helping folks, and as well, and not exclusively from a policing perspective. So that's why I wanted to ask, and I thank you very much for that.
Yep, Councilmember Cunningham, thank you. And I'll step back here. I want to move on to out of advocacy, because I really could talk about that for hours and hours here. And let me talk about the initial projects. I've already mentioned some of the meetings that we had. The other thing that we've been doing is listening sessions with our affected populations. I just came from one over at Hope Harbor, which was our second one there. I've had listening sessions at YouthLink. I just did some training for the Streetworks outreach workers yesterday over in St. Paul. Those are folks that are hitting our streets, and they're amazing people that come out and do it just simply because they care. And so it was a really good opportunity for me to sort of glean their wisdom and their understanding. But they also really wanted to ask us questions. Why do police do this? Why do police do that? How can we better improve our relationship as advocates and street level workers on how we can interact with law enforcement? So to your point, Councilmember Cunningham, that's sort of, I think we're making those important connections there. I've already commented on the remote office space. The other thing that I've been doing a lot is sort of trying to identify this basic need component. I really have a strong belief that if we are going to interact effectively with this community, we have to be meeting basic needs. And the saying that I sort of use is, if we're going to bring a sword, we also have to bring wheat. If we are going to go out and expect compliance with law, we have to make sure that we're taking care of people's basic needs, giving them water, giving them food. We probably have put 36 pairs of shoes on people's feet that needed them. The back of my car is filled with water, and we're making sure that people are getting what they need. And it's been a good connection builder for people to see that this is more than about, this is a procedural justice issue for me, where we're actually making sure that we're having an interaction that doesn't involve handcuffs or telling people to stop doing something. The final piece of this is the action piece. I tend to be action-oriented, and so one of the things we want to make sure we're doing is identifying how that action grows out of our data and our intelligence and our understanding. We want it to be flexible and dynamic. We want it to move and change as information changed, as the migration patterns of people throughout the city change, as they move from here to there. There are different things that really impact that, things with transit, things with different encampments and stuff like that. So we need to make sure we're staying on top of that. And then, of course, the relational aspect to it that I've already spoken about. And one of the biggest single things was targeting across systems, making sure that we are coordinating across those systems. If there's one thing that's come out of many of the meetings I've had, it's been that request for coordination. With regard to that, some of the initial projects, and this has been a big area for us around this action piece. I've spent a considerable amount of time in encampments, building relationships and encouraging people to be accepting the services from St. Stephen's and trying to figure out, not only from a standpoint of actually dealing with the folks that are in that encampment, but also the public that are calling in those encampments. We've been using a smart sheet, and we're in the process of developing that to form a tracking program so that people will actually be able to know what's being done there and to be able to advise that. And then I mentioned already about the shelter, the training of our shelter partners and outreach workers. So I think that gives you a brief structure of it. I apologize, it's a little rough around the edges. If you've heard me do trafficking presentations, it's a little bit more well organized, but this is a new venture for me. So thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Snyder, we have some questions here already. Questions are coming from Councilmember Cunningham, and then we'll take another one from Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this presentation. I was just wondering, where does the co-responder model fit into this, given that a lot of folks who are experiencing homelessness are also experiencing mental health challenges? So how does the co-responder model fit into this?
And Madam Chair, Councilmember Cunningham, thank you. That's actually incredibly important. I appreciate the fact that you brought that up. I'm meeting with the co-responders tomorrow. We've had some important conversations. That was one of the initial data points back several months ago. You know, approximately 78% of people that are out there that are homeless in Hennepin County report having at least one diagnosis and in some cases two. And so we wanted to make sure that we were connecting with those folks that are actually out there doing that work. And so I'll be able to answer that question more directly, and I'd be more than happy to advise you after that meeting and let you know what comes out of that.
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have a question or comment from Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sergeant Snyder, I mean, what can I say? You've brought your same level of personal relationships and everything to this kind of work. That's amazing. This comment isn't for you or about you in any way, but I just know there can be a real disconnect in information and especially trust building between advocacy groups or government organizations and those they actually serve. And I know and love and appreciate everything that you have done to get closer to the people we're serving here. How does that work with the other partnerships that you're aligning here? How do you get the police in general, and how do you get the other partner organizations here closer to what homeless and vulnerable populations need based on your increasing wisdom in this field?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, thank you for that. I think your words are too kind. I wouldn't classify what I know as wisdom in any sense of the word, maybe just momentum. I'll take that word. But I do think that part of what the chief made a comment the other day when we were meeting. He said it's very unusual for a veteran police officer to ask to do something like this. And that's been one of the biggest things. Why were you forced to do this? Well, no, I wasn't forced to do it. And that's been an ongoing theme, right? And so that gives us a real opportunity. It gives me an opportunity to sort of mentor other people. And that's really what I'm trying to do. And that's not just in the police department, though. I mean, that's across disciplines and encouraging advocates. And to the extent that I can sort of let them see my heart, let them see me handing out beef jerky and bottles of water and lemon drops on the corner and making sure that we're connecting. I mean, I'm willing to and believe that that's part of what I'm supposed to be doing, is showing that we can do that.
Thank you.
We have a question or comment from Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Snyder. I'm wondering I know you talked about encampments, and I'm wondering, is panhandling a part of your strategy? And then also you mentioned doing some partnership work or some training with Streetworks, and I think they focus on LGBT homeless folks, right? Is that accurate? Or
Madam Chair, Councilmember Jenkins, thank you. So Can I take the last question first to respond to? Streetworks has a variety of interactions across the whole. They do work primarily with youth and younger adults, I think, up to age 24, and that's primarily where they're focused. But the communities, I think they work with folks from a whole variety of different communities. Some of my best friends have worked very, very closely with the LGBTQ community and kids that are out there. And in fact, when I was doing trafficking work, we had a lot of intersections there around the work that I had done. And so those relationships continue to be in place. And in fact, that's how I was invited to join the Streetworks folks for their monthly meetings and actually do some training. And it's been phenomenal. So yes, Streetworks, I think, serves directly that community. And I'm getting a lot of guidance in the same way that they'd guided me previously with victims of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. I apologize, I spaced out. Oh, you're talking about panhandling. Forgive me. So panhandling it's so endemic to the issue of homelessness, and because people are trying to get their needs met. And so there's a variety of different issues, I think, that come up around that. And it's a nuanced problem. I can't tell you that I have a great solution for it. I believe firmly that if we have to go where our population is, and so if they're going to go where their needs are met to some extent. And so a part of this strategy is trying to evaluate and see, where can we be of most help? How can we improve systems of justice? I was out with some friends that live out on the street over in the 3rd Precinct. Just this weekend, I showed up to give them some water and some breakfast, and they'd been assaulted while they were panhandling. And so that's an opportunity for me to serve and get them connected with, medical care and different things like that.
On 31st and 2nd Avenue?
Actually, right over by the joint, so it'd be like Cedar and 9th, right in there. They were sleeping on the sidewalk. So,
yeah, that's usually directly related to encampments.
Sure.
And a big sort of, I think, from a perception, public safety issue. But they're standing right next to the freeway, like cars walking into traffic. There's just all kinds of issues beyond the homeless and potential mental health issues, as well as chemical dependency issues. So I just feel like that should be a whole part of the analysis when you're doing this work.
Absolutely, Councilmember Jenkins. I'm more than happy to follow up with you after I have more information. We really are building this from nothing, and so I apologize for some of the things that may look like gaps. I'm trying to figure it out as we go.
Right.
But I promise
I'm trying to help.
Pardon?
I'm trying to help fill some of those gaps.
Totally appreciate that, and I will make sure and give you feedback on that as we evolve in those discussions.
Okay. Thank you.
Wonderful. Did you have another?
I did.
Okay, so we have another question or comment from Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Sergeant. I just wanted to ask real quick, are y'all in the process, or have you gotten to the process yet of being able to walk through what that workflow would look, or that flow would look like if there was to be, let's say, a homeless camp that's down by Upper Harbor Terminal or something? Are y'all in a place yet to be able to say, like, this is what we would do to respond to that?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Cunningham, yes, that's actually what we're working on right now. I've probably spent the last 2 weeks, I've had probably 15 meetings specifically around that issue, and I've really prioritized those folks that are out there actually doing the work, like St. Stephen's and stuff. But I want to figure out a way that we as a police department can respond in a way that encourages that. And so that was one of the questions that I asked them. What can I do to help you? And they're like, encourage them to accept our services, encourage them to take it seriously. And so, yes, we're in the process of doing that. I will absolutely give you feedback and email you what that protocol looks like. I made a promise to the 3rd Precinct folks this week that I would have a rough protocol next week. So you can expect something on your email next week.
Thank you very much, Sergeant.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Snyder. I just have one question related to this. How does this position and role that you're now currently enacting, how does it connect to or leverage the other work the city might be involved in regarding addressing the homelessness issue. And I know there's the Heading Home Hennepin plan that I believe the city has been an active partner in. I'm not quite sure where that project is at currently, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about, are there other staff members throughout the enterprise that also work on this topic? Just partly because I'm just not familiar. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about how this work looks across the organization.
Madam Chair, thank you. As I understand it, and this comes directly from the chief, so I have no reason to doubt this, but I'm the only city employee that's dedicated 100% of the time, full-time, to work on this issue. And my commitment is to not do it all myself, because I can't, but to figure out a way to leverage, using your word, sort of our partnership across systems and throughout the city to be able to make sure that we're all working together. There are people that have been doing things that frankly probably shouldn't be doing them because it really doesn't fit, like regulatory services. I'm meeting with them immediately after this meeting, and we're probably going to take over something from them that frankly fits better in the police department. I know this is an atypical police role. I get that. I think that's part of the reason for much of the confusion around it. But I also think there are things that just police can do in this, and for those things that then there's a whole bunch of things that police or other people can do. And I just want to, as a full-time employee focused on this, I want to bring the best, not only that the city, or not only the police department, but also that the city has to bear on this, and sort of provide a template for where do we go. I mean, I'm 55, I'm not going to be here forever, but I would like to be a participant in the beginning part of this. So I'm confident we're going to move in the right direction.
That's great. Thank you. No, I appreciate the department's leadership and vision in bringing this position forward, and thank you for stepping up to the challenge. I think that from the work that I've seen you do on commercial sexual exploitation, I'm really confident that the skills and expertise that you built in that field or sector will be very readily used in this particular area that connects to one of our mayor's top priorities in terms of affordable housing and housing for all in our city. And of course, the council has really also invested a lot of energy and time into that. So looking forward to hearing your recommendations on how to improve our work, maybe a year from now after you've been doing this for a couple of months. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so that was the Homelessness and Vulnerable Populations Initiative, and this is a receive and file report. So all those in favor to receive and file this, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? This motion moves forward, and our next discussion item is a presentation on the Eviction and Calls for Service study by our Police Conduct Oversight Commission. And if our staff members could please guide us through this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Kano, Council Vice President Jenkins, council members. My name is Imani Jafar. I'm the Director of the Office of Police Conduct Review. Today, I'm going to be presenting to you the study that we did that focuses on the Conduct on Licensed Premises Ordinance. We, as the staff of the Office of Police Conduct Review, did this at the request of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission, but we did it in conjunction with some very important community partners who came to attend the presentation today. Director Luke Grunman from Mid-Minnesota Legal Assistance, and Larry McDonough, who's a housing attorney who's nationally known and is currently working at Dorsey and Whitney, but worked for Legal Aid for many, many years. Larry is going to leave early to get his daughter on the bus. So just so you know when he gets up. But today, our intention here is to give you an overview of the issue and the topic and how it came to the attention of the commission, and then also talk about some of the areas that arose as things that you should focus on. So the landlord training, management plans, lockouts, which were a collateral issue that we didn't actually go into the study intending to research, but were voiced by so many advocates that we worked into this study. Ryan Patrick, who is the legal analyst for our office, is going to go through a data review, and then we'll go through what the Police Conduct Oversight Commission's recommendations were. So first, as we get into this topic, Luke Grunman and his colleague Georgina Santos came to the commission specifically to address the issue of police interaction related to conduct on premises ordinance and made a presentation to the PCOC that kind of launched this study. So to get a handle on it, we thought what we'd do first is go through the relevant law. So first is actually the conduct on licensed premises ordinance itself, which is 244.2020. Now, conduct on licensed premises is an ordinance that is essentially triggered when a property is classified as disorderly or a problem property, and then the city involvement triggers from that point. And we're going to talk a lot about what that flow is and how it can really impact the residents in the city of Minneapolis. Conduct on premises is a very wide-ranging ordinance. So things as small as an underage drinking violation in a rental property can trigger it, all the way up to like serious drug trafficking and use. So the consequences are the same despite a wide variety of crimes. So that's something that can be problematic that was raised by a lot of the advocates. There are two primary entities in the city that are in charge of enforcement: the Minneapolis Police Department and Regulatory Services. Now, as this ordinance came about in 1990, and as it kind of progressed, a lot of the enforcement fell on MPD. It went from kind of a co-responder sort of program that had a civilian and a cop paired together called SAFE that seemed to be very popular, but then lost its funding. And then it went to crime prevention specialists, and then it went to one person to enforce the entire ordinance and do the training. So that's a lot on one person. So a big discussion with, and we'll talk through who the community partners were about how that's working. The next thing to know is the notices that get sent out to landlords as a result of some kind of criminal activity on the property can actually lead to a notice to vacate, which is a more subtle version of an eviction, essentially. So asking someone to leave without filing anything, but can actually lead to a formal eviction. So where the eviction law is 504B. 504B285 is kind of the general eviction statute in Minnesota, but there's two areas that popped out during the study. One is domestic violence protection. So under 504B.205, if you have been the victim of domestic violence, then you should be exempted from conduct on licensed premises. And that's a protection that is something we'll talk about later about how it's being administered. The other thing is there's a protection against lockouts, that a landlord cannot just lock a tenant out. If they want to properly remove them from a property, then they have to go through steps within a court of law. And a lockout is, as Larry McDonough raised during the study, usually a cost-benefit analysis for the landlords who engage in them, saying that it's probably cheaper to just lock them out than file an eviction. So typically a tenant will come home and their property will be locked. But there's a specific protection against that in the law. So the participants we interviewed for the study, Mid-Minnesota Legal Assistance, Homeline, a tenant advocacy group that many of you are probably familiar with, Larry McDonough, who's here with us, Commander Charlie Adams, who's leading kind of the changes that are undergoing in the department, Sergeant Jeff Egge and his analyst, Brian Smith from the innovation team, Noah Shuckman, who's the Director of Regulatory Services, and Councilmember Cunningham, because he had already started leading work on the ordinance itself, and we wanted to capture kind of what was happening at the time we presented this. So to go into the areas of concern, one was the landlord training. So as I mentioned before, it had gotten to the point where things have already actually started changing as we looked into the issue, which is the good news. But at the time that we started looking into the issue, landlord training was conducted by one person who was solely focusing on eviction and legal advice. So what was happening was that landlords who were going to start being a landlord, going through training in the city of Minneapolis, were attending a training where the primary focus was, if a problem comes up with someone, no matter how small, a good way to resolve this is to evict or remove them from the property. And just for your review, we actually we got all of the materials from those trainings so you could kind of get an idea of what was going on before. There was police involvement in the training, and there was a considerable amount of concern about the tone that sets with the landlord. So is that maybe a scary thing to walk into a room to see that a police officer is training that there's a huge consequence, right? That maybe I'm going to just have to evict if this looks like I need to evict. So that was an issue, is that the right place for the police? And the police were specifically concerned about whether that was the right place for them too, and were probably the first entity that voiced concern about that not being a great fit. And there was overarching concern between advocates, between city enterprise officials that we talked to, and the police department about how to create the right tone between police and landlords so that it is a more community-based approach, that even if a tenant ends up leaving a property, that it's something that can be done in a more positive way to start that process. Of course, evictions are going to happen, but limiting it to the situations where they're absolutely necessary and not essentially marketing evictions as a first line of defense or first way to respond to a conduct unlicensed premises violation. So the second thing that's all part of this is the management plan. So let's say you're a landlord, you have a tenant that has, for some reason has triggered one of these conduct unlicensed premises issues. So the next thing that would happen is you would receive a management plan in the mail, and that plan gives you 10 days to respond. We also put sample language in the study that you can see about what the management plans look like. And the management plans really, kind of push the idea of a notice to vacate. Notice to vacate is problematic for the city looking at this problem because a notice to vacate isn't tracked anywhere. When a landlord was sending a tenant a notice to vacate, it was just, it doesn't have to be reported back. There's no statistics on how often. A lot of tenants are very afraid if they receive one, they're going to be evicted anyway. And evictions can be devastating for people. They stay on your record for 10 years. They're incredibly hard to expunge. There's a lot of difficulties with navigating having an eviction on your record. So people will leave out of fear. You all likely know this, but because the vacancy rate in Minneapolis rental property is hovering around 2%, it's difficult to even find new places to live. So it's kind of apropos that we're coming right after the homelessness issue, because this can be something that can contribute to homelessness. So the appearance of a requirement to oust the tenants was completely problematic. The other thing that we found was, in talking to all the advocates, was the state law protections that I mentioned earlier, specifically the VAWA, domestic violence protections, were mentioned nowhere in the notice. So, and the other thing was that the tenants weren't getting notice at all. So notice was going out to the landlord, block club leaders, and in some instances, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, but never to the tenants. So a lot of times, for those of you more familiar with domestic violence calls, it may not come across in the first instance as a domestic violence call. It might be a neighbor calling for noise, but the noise might be coming from a domestic violence incident. So if you were the tenant who's a victim of domestic violence, you got no notice of this and no opportunity to respond. And there was nothing built into the notices. So everyone was very concerned about that. And the other thing was the accuracy. When you have one person who's in charge of this huge job of sending all of these out, you can't catch those issues. You may not be able to have time to comb through the underlying analysis. So, there was a lot of concern that this was too big of a job for one person. And should this really be housed in the police department if it's going to be affecting rental licensing? So those were the type of discussions that we were having. So lockouts was the collateral issue that I mentioned that came up, which I talked about before. A landlord changes the locks and the tenant's personal items are usually removed, either put on a sidewalk, they're put in a storage unit. Specifically for low-income tenants, that can be very devastating. It can be hard. They can lose all of their belongings and have zero way to get them back. They are, in fact, illegal in the state of Minnesota. However, and even with our discussions with the police department, they had said that they've trained for many years that it's a civil matter. Well, actually, it's a criminal matter. It's a misdemeanor. It can be cited. And if you're looking especially at landlords who are using it in a cost-benefit analysis, what better way to get them to stop doing than to actually cite it? So a lot of the feedback we got is this is a huge problem. It's often related to conduct on premises issues. So maybe they've gotten a notice and they just lock the person out and then they want to be done with it. But a better way to resolve it would be a more community-based way. And if these landlords do know that Minneapolis police officers are trained and will issue them a citation on this, then that could help stop the problem. So that was a big discussion point that came kind of very connected to the issue we were looking at. So now I'm going to turn it over to legal analyst Ryan Patrick to talk about the data that we used to kind of get the results for the study.
Thank you, Director Jafar, Chair Cano. We received a lot of data from the Minneapolis Police Department. They were very cooperative. Data spanning all the way up to 2017, way back to the 90s. So we had a lot of data to analyze for this report, and we decided to look at it in 3 different ways. So what, out of the overall data set, what could we learn from it? We picked a sample out of that data set, a smaller sample, to be able to determine whether or not any of those instances in that sample kind of ran afoul of those state law protections, and I'll discuss that again. And then within that sample, reading all the reports, reading the dispatch logs, looking at the information, what can we glean? What is actually going on in those calls? And just first, the majority of the time,
conduct on licensed premises enforcement occurs as the result of a warrant where officers are seizing evidence of narcotics, weapons. Frequently, this is being used in the way that it was intended, where you have a house that involves narcotics trafficking. Well, that's not always the case. But narcotics was by far the most frequent trigger. And so the general category is narcotics, but we know within narcotics, you have everything ranging from small amount for personal use, residue in a baggie, all the way up to pounds and pounds of drugs that are going on the street to be sold. So narcotics is pretty vague, and I'll talk about some specific instances that show kind of the range of narcotics when I get to some of the individual cases. Another thing we noticed looking at the larger data set was that 72 different neighborhoods in Minneapolis had properties that were affected by the conduct on premises ordinance, but just 8 of those represented 51% of the notices, went to just 8 neighborhoods, and those were in specifically North Minneapolis. If you look at the study, those neighborhoods are called out. So where is this ordinance being applied most frequently? Well, we know that over half of them are occurring in just 8 out of the 72 different neighborhoods. One of the other areas for concern with the data was that while we have information on where the property was, who the landlord was, the fact that a management plan was issued, and a satisfactory management plan was returned, we don't know the outcomes. We don't, after the enforcement occurs, after a notice to vacate goes out, we don't really know what happens. We're missing data kind of on the back end and really the human impact resulting from enforcement. So like I mentioned,
If I could just pause for 1 second, going back to the other slide, could you go back one slide? I'm curious, do you have the breakdown of where the other 49% of the issues lie? So clearly there's a kind of a concentration here in North Minneapolis of 51%. I'm wondering if the rest of it is scattered throughout the city, or if you do see kind of 30% bulk here, 20% bulk here. Is that information?
I can certainly provide that information. I'm not sure if the neighborhood by neighborhood breakdown is in the report, but yeah, there are other pockets.
Are there other pockets?
Concentration, okay. And then the rest are kind of spread.
Okay. I was kind of wondering if there were other
yeah.
kind of like, maybe not as, the
Certainly
numbers
not,
weren't as high, but were still considered like a concentration of.
Yeah, Chair Cano, certainly not as high a concentration, but I can certainly provide the breakdown neighborhood by neighborhood and across years.
Yeah, I'd be curious. And then just a technical question on the word narcotics. Does that include marijuana possession, or?
It appeared to in some cases, yeah.
Okay, because I know we're trying to look at that issue through a different lens, and just curious how that's playing out in this. So from the legal definition of the term narcotics, it would involve any calls surrounding possession of marijuana or usage of it, I guess.
Yeah, Chair Cano, the range in narcotics varies pretty extensively in police coding. So some of this comes down to what an actual call or the police report, what coding was entered into the report, be it narcotics, because they seized a large amount of marijuana versus heroin. We see the whole gamut in the cases. So,
Okay, thank you.
So we selected a sample of sufficient size that if we went through every case and were able to determine that, in fact, these were your hallmark classic enforcement cases where they're seizing a large amount of drugs or weapons, if we saw that across the entire sample, we could safely conclude with 95% certainty that the ordinance was working as expected, not running afoul of those state law protections. However, within the sample, we located one case. We highlighted domestic violence specifically because of our past report that we presented, but also because it's very clearly called out in both federal and state protections. We did locate a case where a domestic partner assaulted another, strangulation, weapon involved, fled the property, was arrested a short time later, and it triggered a conduct on premises enforcement notice. The address for the person who committed the assault was not the address of the rental property and where the conduct on premises notice was sent to that specific landlord. So we can be pretty certain that it was applied to the person who was living in the unit who was not the assaulter, but was in fact the person who called 911 because they were being abused. And therefore, because of that located in the sample, we conclude the error rate is not 0. And these are state law protections. When we're talking about an acceptable rate of error, an error rate of not 0 is unacceptable. And so within that sample, because it's a smaller sample, we're looking at cases. If we're seeing stuff pop up within those cases, we can likely conclude that it's not an isolated incident. And there were a number of other issues that popped up that we found worth further examination, and in future discussions about how this is applied, it may be worth taking into consideration. So for instance, multiple cases where in the police report you saw a variety of young children present who were living at the property. So an example case, officers had a warrant to arrest somebody. They knew that that person frequented one of their family members' houses. They arrested the person at that family member's house, and they had a gun on them at the time. So the weapons arrest occurred at that property. The police report notes when they did the arrest that a variety of young children under 10 were present. Conduct on premises kicked in. The notice was sent. Another instance we saw were notices being sent for violations occurring in sober living facilities or halfway houses for narcotics specifically. So you have a sober living facility where you have support staff there working with tenants to address their issues with narcotics. Perhaps they're in a better position to determine whether that person should stay in the unit than the ordinance. We saw multiple cases where people called for service because a heroin overdose was occurring. Officers came, they administered Narcan, saved the person's life, but because there were narcotics located at the property, the conduct on premises enforcement occurred. And you certainly don't want to have a chilling effect and push people out of their housing when they're dealing with, obviously, drug dependency issues. Now we know that this person has drug dependency issues. If you're forcing them out to an unknown location, how are you going to provide follow-up services after that? We saw instances where there were juvenile suspects who were living with their parents, so they did some form of criminal activity outside of the property, but they were arrested at the house. So you have 13, 14-year-olds engaging in criminal activity, but then their parents are really bearing the brunt of this by being essentially not being able to live in their rental property anymore. So they're dealing with both the criminal justice system's interaction with their child and trying to find new housing at the same time. And then mental health issues. So people were experiencing mental health issues. That's what led the police to come to the property in the first place. One instance of a person reporting a fake assault because they wanted to be killed by the police when they arrived. So they set up a situation in which they thought they were going to be shot by the police when they arrived. They weren't. The officers handled it well and got the person to crisis. But since that call was tagged as an assault, not that one occurred, it triggered that conduct on premises enforcement again. So those are the areas in the data that we saw kind of highlighted some of the issues that we heard from the advocates. We did see those pop up in the data and wanted to bring it to your attention. I'll turn it back over to the director. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chair Cano, to your question too, Mr. Patrick did include a visual of the data he collected for the neighborhood pockets. So in the back of the report, you can actually kind of see where those pockets are in a visual complaint map. Thank you. Of course. So for the recommendations that the commission voted, finalized the report, and that's why we're presenting to you now, here are the things that they came away with that they wanted to recommend. One is updating the landlord training. The nice thing that happened during this is that as we started to interview people from the Minneapolis Police Department, they did start to look into what was going on in the training and put it on hold. They actually scaled back the training, took the crime prevention specialist who was doing it off of the training, put community engagement team officers to do a small 6-page or 7-page PowerPoint on conduct on licensed premises, and put regulatory services in more of a role to do the training. So that's happening, but it really is kind of a Band-Aid right now. It needs to be a more formalized training. And a couple of the things that really came out a lot during the interviews was education on equity and fair housing, giving landlords in Minneapolis the tools so that they can equitably deal with tenants and deal with them in a fair way, and that they know the fair housing law so that they're not discriminating, whether it's on purpose or accidentally. So using those trainings as a way to give landlords better tools to deal with the residents is really crucial. Another thing that the police department was the first entity to say this, but using non-MPD trainers. There were even suggestions that a crime prevention specialist could attend the training just to introduce themselves as a resource for landlords, but that taking this focus off of, almost one of the words that was used in one of the meetings was scaring the landlords into thinking they had to evict at the first sign of an issue, even if it's something as small as some of the incidents that Mr. Patrick described, that's not a good way to go about things. And that's not the community that a lot of people wanted to live and work in, and that there are just better ways to address this. So potentially shifting the focus to having regulatory services doing the trainings, but having the equity groups within the city participate in fashioning those trainings to make sure that all of the right information is being captured. The next thing was revising the ordinance, which that work is underway, and we tried to capture in this study what Councilmember Cunningham has done. I've been in those meetings. I think the direction is very positive. There's a clear end date. There are clear goals going, and that it addresses a lot of the issues that we raised in the report. But I think one consistent thing that we heard was the ordinance doesn't need to be thrown away. But what it needs is a lot of work to clarify the enforcement and how it should be carried out. That some of these things are happening because the ordinance itself just needs more clarity within it, and figuring out ways, for example, to create a management plan process. So you don't have one person running, that you have some kind of formal mechanism that can have oversight, and that you can make sure that management plans are going to the right people in the right way, and that those protections for things like domestic violence that are very important are worked in, and that people aren't getting targeted who are quite vulnerable. And along with that, improving the screening mechanism, making sure that the people getting management plans are the people who should be getting management plans, and that we're making sure to abide by state law in doing that. The last is one of the last things is changing the notice of the violation. So providing options, so that heavy focus on evictions or notice to vacate was something that was consistently across the board everyone wanted to see gone. There were other suggestions in the report, such as cash for keys, where you agree on a term out, a move out date. A landlord will return, the security deposit. Tenant gives the keys and they're done, and everyone can go on their separate ways. Another thing that was brought up was mutual lease termination negotiations. Doing that, one thing that came up in Councilmember Cunningham's group is using a community navigator, having someone go out to figure out what's actually going on, especially in the lower level situations, and seeing if there's more positive ways to resolve it. So letting landlords know, this is part of giving them the tools to respond better, that there are other options, that eviction should be seen as a last resort. There are still going to be instances where eviction is the only option, and no one's saying that should be off the table. But I think understanding how difficult it is for both landlords to file and go through evictions, and tenants to then defend and bear the eviction afterwards, it's a cost on both sides. So there are just other more collaborative methods you can go through first. So having that notice kind of reflect that is really key. Sending it to both landlords and tenants. I think a lot of people, including the commission, were concerned that tenants weren't getting notice. Taking the Hennepin County Attorney's Office out of it, unless there's a formal discovery request in conjunction with a trial, but no proactive notices. Also, the block club leaders, that just puts pressure on a landlord, where if it's a lower level situation that can be resolved, let the landlord and tenant resolve that. Also an opportunity to respond. So catching, if we can't catch those domestic violence calls because they don't appear on their face as domestic violence, having an opportunity to respond can be that tenant victim's ability to say, hey, well, this like party, loud noise that my neighbor called on, well, it's because, my partner was assaulting me, and that's why this is happening. I need protection. And then you can get them in conjunction with other services as well, so that there's a win-win in that. But having some sort of opportunity to respond. Another thing that was mentioned in conjunction with the Hennepin County Attorney's notification was that sheriff's data was occasionally being used. And, being the city of Minneapolis, that's probably not a best practice to be using the sheriff's data. So just using that at all should be excluded. You can use police reporting and referral to handle those calls. And notice to any outside parties, like we discussed before, it really should be landlord and tenant focused so the problem can be resolved in the best way. And then this one's a little bit simpler, I think, to carry out, but in-service training for police officers to address lockouts. Larry McDonough, who is here, has actually done some training for the cadets, but cadets are new officers. We need to train the officers who are actually on the street to redo this, because it's been many, many years of them thinking lockouts are a civil matter. So we really kind of need to re-educate here and give them the tools they need to deal with it, because it's a really serious issue. And for some of you, it occurs in your wards more than others. And so that can be a good way to take care of it. We think that it's probably easier for the city to contract with outside trainers to do that rather than create a conflict of interest within the city on those cases. And honestly, any one of the advocacy organizations that we interviewed, and there are many others, could conduct that training. City data collection, as Mr. Patrick mentioned, mandatory reporting for all notices to vacate. I think that is a huge gap that was identified during the study, that it's of interest to all of us to know when a landlord issues a notice to vacate and if the tenant actually leaves. And then also saying if it results in an eviction. So if they don't leave. And even in the innovation team study, which we included as an appendix in the report, you can actually see there's kind of this gap about knowing how these are related. So if, as part of their licensing requirement, if you just require them to report this back or require it as part of the management plan, then you're going to capture all that data and you can really see what's going on. And also reporting all occupants. I think Mr. Patrick did a nice job of mentioning all of the young people who are affected. So that way you can also grab some numbers about how many children are affected by this. So really understanding that you're going to need the landlords to really report notices to vacate to get a better handle. And we thought as well, having a public dashboard with non-identifying information would even give residents answers to some of these questions, and also a snapshot for city leadership to help them make better decisions about this issue. I know that was a lot of information, and the report has a lot of appendices, but we'd be happy to take any questions from you if you have more questions.
One question or comment from Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Director Jafar and Mr. Patrick, for all your hard work. This is an issue that I came into office already focused on because 5 out of the 8 neighborhoods that make up the 51% are in my ward, and I live in one of them. I share, granted, 2 of them with Ward 5, but this is a huge, huge issue in my ward. And it's an issue for many folks. I think that it's been this part. First of all, I read from beginning to end of this research. It's wonderful. Thank you for all your hard work. You guys are on fire with the research. And I also wanted to say though that here it's telling the untold story of the conduct on licensed premises ordinance, because when I was out talking to folks in my community, the things that I heard were, it's the renters. They're bad landlords. But it really emphasized that it's bad renters and we need to get renters out. The problem properties, the only way to address them, they're all this extreme, right? It's like this extreme of next thing I know, my neighbors are probably selling drugs. And so therefore they're making a lot of assumptions. And so I really appreciate this part of the story because, and having it quantified, because when I'm talking to folks, they don't believe me. They don't believe me that this is being misused to harm people, particularly vulnerable renters. And another big thing that's kind of a gap, but we've talked about it in the work group, is that we know that chronic criminal and disruptive behavior is not exclusive to rental properties. And so looking at how that lens has created a narrative in North Minneapolis, which is also racial, because when we look at who are renters and who are homeowners, that has put a lot of tension, racial tension in particular, in our community. So thank you very much for all your hard work on this, to be able to name the challenges of those who don't have a voice and who are experiencing the harm of this ordinance being implemented historically the way that it has been. I'm grateful for this because it answered a lot of the questions that I came in asking about, like, well, what happens when it gets activated? Because it hasn't been transparent and clear. So thank you so much for naming it out. I was right now finally mapping what the process looked like with more clarity. And I think we're going to get some really, really good work done in our work group. So thank you so much for all of this.
You're most welcome.
We have another comment or question from Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ms. Jafar. So I'm curious, is notice to vacate, is that a legal proceeding? Because you asked that, you recommend that should be a mandatory report.
Chair Cano, Council Vice President Jenkins, it is not a legal proceeding, but they are usually very formal looking notices. And if you look at the management plan notice, the way it was going out, there were suggestions in notice to vacate, and the training had a lot of information about notices to vacate.
Mm-hmm.
But they are kind of formal letters and documents. They don't typically go through the court, but a lot of times a landlord will just issue one to a tenant saying, you know, if you don't leave in 7 days or you don't leave in 2 weeks, I'll file an eviction against you. If the notice to vacate is issued, a landlord could report back saying that, you know, I sent the tenant a notice to vacate, and then they can report back if they actually left. So I think the helpfulness in having that is because it is a mechanism that is happening specifically in response to a conduct on licensed premises violation. You can see how many times, if a letter is being sent out by the city, the tenant is actually leaving. And it doesn't mean that it's a bad situation that they leave or not, but I think it would be important to capture how often the tenants are actually leaving, because that was a question that we asked, like, well, how many people are turning over homes? And that was a question that we couldn't get answered. And one interesting thing that happened was we actually presented a continuing legal education course yesterday with MMLA. And one of the landlord attorneys brought up how difficult this issue is for landlords and how much pressure they feel to vacate. And that, you know, kind of indicating that they wouldn't mind tracking it. But the other thing they said too is that with a notice to vacate, you know, they don't often want to do that, but they feel pressured by the city. And so that's, I think, as you change the notices themselves about the management plan and what people do, it would just be good to track that information.
And who would they report it to?
So I think that the work group should probably sit down and discuss who it should report to. You know, our gut instinct was regulatory services, just because ultimately it can impact a landlord's licensing. So if they have that information about the notice to vacates and they collect it, I mean, that could be one space, but there's other spaces in the city where it could go to. But I think it would benefit from a look with community partners and people within the city to decide what exactly should be collected, how it gets collected, and who it goes to.
Okay. And then, do we have clarity around how much the percentage of evictions are related to inability to pay as opposed to some of these other challenges with criminal behavior and drug use and all of that stuff?
Chair Cano and Council Vice President Jenkins. So the innovation team has done some work on the evictions, but I can tell you, even from, I had a previous life as a housing attorney representing tenants. The difficulty is that even when the underlying issue is something different, a lot of times it gets filed as a failure to pay, that the inability to pay, or just saying that they haven't paid their rent. But sometimes a tenant is holding on to their rent because they feel like they've been treated unfairly. They don't have repairs. So the innovation team has done a great job at a first slice at the eviction, and their study is in ours. We put it as an appendix so you can see the numbers. But I understand from interviewing them for this project, they're doing further work to try and drill down to the actual causes. But my understanding is non-payment of rent is often the most cited reason for eviction. But just having worked in that field, it's often a lot more complicated than non-payment of rent.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
so much.
And we have a question or comment from Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Director Jafar, for this report. I think it's really valuable. I want to kind of pick up on this theme of landlords feeling pressure to evict. And I'm wondering if we've taken full stock of sort of where that comes from. You mentioned the trainings that the city is doing, but it feels a little bit bigger than that. And I think referencing Councilmember Cunningham's comments about the sort of almost neighborhood perception of like, that's a bad landlord. They let people with criminal records stay there. There's a social pressure that I think we need to change the narrative on as we sort of think about how this is going to get enacted. I also think that I'm wondering if we've talked to enough landlords to understand all the pressures that are on them. Does it impact their insurance? Are there professional association trainings outside of what the city's doing that are reinforcing that narrative? Are they talking amongst themselves and comparing notes and identifying, ways that they sort of create this story about what they're obligated to do? So I'm curious if beyond the trainings that are provided, if we understand how that pressure is getting created.
Chair Cano, Councilmember Fletcher, I think it's a really good question. You can see from the report, it's very multifaceted, right? The training is one part of it, but when you get a notice that kind of reinforces that, well, an easy way to handle this within 10 days, which is a very short turnaround time, is to just send a notice to vacate, that there's that, plus the feeling that you're afraid that you may lose your license. And you can kind of see just there's this consistent theme and fear. And if the notices for the management plan and the violation of conduct on premises are going to block club leaders and other people in the neighborhood who may be aware, it's creating a pressure cooker, right? And it was interesting to hear from a landlord attorney yesterday that in a lot of his clients' cases, he said that they actually didn't want to evict the tenant. They would have rather worked it out, but they're feeling too much pressure. And so I think, a good plan of action could be to start fixing the nuts and bolts parts of it first, cleaning up the areas that may be able to do that with a lot of people who are frankly already looking at the issue and have been talking about it for a while, but are just kind of waiting for the opportunity to kind of repair that. And then I think, also bringing the community in and talking to landlords is valuable about how they feel about those violations. But I do think there's strain on both sides. It's a tenant and landlord. And a lot of landlords you talk to will tell you that evictions are hard to carry out too, because they have to pay to file. You have to come to court. It's usually a process that isn't pleasant for either party. So I think having a more transparent way that helps residents and their landlords work out things is a better way to go. And I know in Councilmember Cunningham's group, there's a lot of talk about, using the community navigators as a way to facilitate what is actually going on. And if something like that was to go forward, or something like the SAFE program that they used to have, you can kind of correct a lot of those narratives just by doing good work in the community. But I think you're right that it'll take kind of a multifaceted approach to get at all those ways and to kind of change the tone. But people are very familiar from what we found in the research with the current system. And I think just changing that is going to have a big impact right away. And then the rest of it will have to be worked on. And
then when you talked about trainings for landlords, you talked about training them on the way we currently train them on these notices to vacate. But when you talked about training about lockouts, you talked about training officers. And I'm wondering, do we train landlords? And do we take advantage of those trainings when we have opportunities to get landlords in the room to tell them that lockouts are violations of law and to make sure that those expectations are clear?
Chair Cano and Councilmember Fletcher, I think that would be a great idea. Because I think some people do things because they don't have information, and some people don't realize what the potential consequences could be. And if you are letting people know that, hey, this is a criminal violation, both for the officers, and if you work that into the landlord training to say there are other ways to resolve this, you will likely see change. You're welcome.
We have another comment or question from Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Upon my analysis of this particular ordinance, really, I feel like one of the underlying issues is that I feel like it's fundamentally flawed because of the pressure that it puts on landlords to regulate their tenants' behaviors. There's no research that shows that that is actually an effective way of lowering crime and criminal behavior, individuals or on the neighborhood level. And so as we are looking at revamping really this ordinance, it's really we're addressing a lot of those pressures that have been put onto landlords of, I did not know that I have a tenant who was going to commit criminal behaviors on the premises that I rented to them. So that should not be the responsibility necessarily of the landlord to figure out how to regulate that behavior, whereas we have other mechanisms that are in place in other ways. So pulling that all together, but I just wanted to name that because we talked a lot about landlord pressures, but fundamentally we have the pressure on them to regulate their tenants' behaviors, and that's an unrealistic approach to modifying behavior. Wanted to share, folks had talked about landlords and landlord advocacy groups having a voice. We are, as a part of the timeline in the work group, we are having community work groups who are going to be giving feedback and engaged in the process. They're going to be giving thoughts before we really get into the writing component, and then feedback on what we create. So I want to let folks know that we're going to be really intentional about getting as many stakeholders at the table. And so my question that I have is, we talked about the I-Team's eviction study and their role. They're at the table with this work group. I know that they've created a landlord training to address this concern. What happened with that? Where's it at? How does it fit into what we're doing moving forward?
Chair Cano, Councilmember Cunningham. So that the I-Team did work quite a bit on landlord trading and had input and I think some cooperation from regulatory services. It was implemented for a very short time and then stopped. So there's already good training materials out there for the work group to convene and look at, but I think they probably, with the new results and information they have access to and what the old training looked like, I think this would be a great time to revisit that. And we specifically named the innovation team in the work group because they have done so much work on it. It doesn't really make sense. I think it would be a great opportunity to take what they've worked on and expand on that. And just to your point about the ordinance, I mean, the birth of these ordinances in the United States came as a result of the crack house epidemic, in the 80s. And they just haven't changed much across the nation since that time. So I think there was that idea that, this landlord is enabling all this criminal activity and and it was terrible. But then when the focus shifted and there were all these smaller crimes and they became the bulk of what the enforcement was, the question became, is this what this really was supposed to be? And so I think it's a really good thing that the revision of the ordinance is already underway and looking at how do we make it work for the modern time.
Just to share with my colleagues, there are 59 other cities that have conduct on premises similar problem property ordinances, and across the country this has disproportionately harmed low-income Black and Brown folks. And so as we are moving forward with our work here at the city, we are being very intentional about completely couching it in equity. We have Joy and her team at the table to make sure that we're looking at it from an equity perspective. But in comparison to other cities, we got some work ahead of us to make sure that we're actually holding folks accountable while also not causing harm to vulnerable folks as well. So thank you so much for all your work, team.
Well, without further questions, thank you so much for this very informative and important study. Appreciate all the engagement from the council members on this topic and your work on this issue. Thank you. So our final item for today. Oh, thank you. Yes, I will go ahead and make a motion to receive and file the eviction and calls for service study. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That item moves forward. Yep, and we have one question from Councilmember Cunningham.
Would it be possible for you to send that presentation to the council? Awesome, thank you.
All righty. So the last item on our agenda for today is the contract amendment with Hennepin County regarding the Hennepin County Jail. And I'm not sure if we have an actual staff member here from the City Attorney's Office to help us walk us through this, but I will just contextualize this for the council members here today. This was an effort that Councilmember Cam Gordon and I worked on together. We had a meeting with our city attorney, city coordinator, our CFO, and MPD to figure out when do we have the opportunity to renew our contract with the Hennepin County Jail. It sounds like the timing will be happening towards the end of this year. It is a significant contract, and so what we'd like to do is direct the city coordinator's office in conjunction with the Minneapolis Police Department and the City Attorney's Office to seek amendments to the contract for jail services to include provisions that promote a separation between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement and protect the city's immigrant communities to the greatest extent that is consistent with federal law and any other applicable state laws or rules. So if you have any questions I see that Councilmember Cam Gordon has joined us for this. Would you like to share some comments with the committee?
I would. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate this coming forward. This is something that I've been pushing on and wanting to look into since at least last year. And before some of you were on the council, we actually got a letter from the sheriff explaining what his policies and procedures are at the jail, and I can share that with all of you if you want. One thing that he talks about in here is communicating with ICE, and also if ICE requests notification of when a certain individual is going to be released, he will notify them. And he reported that in 2016, we received 267 requests for notification. That was only 0.85% of the inmates, but ICE actually picked up 68 inmates after their release. And that seems significant to me. I did have a conversation with him on the telephone, and he explained to me that in those instances, they are released in the secure Sally Port, and they're delivered to ICE from the sheriff's office directly. And I have more information that I can certainly share at other times, but the big concern that I had is we want to have a separation ordinance. We want it to be really clear that our police, and it is clear, it's really important, aren't cooperating with ICE. You can call 911, you can get emergency services, you can get assistance, and we're not going to be cooperating with Homeland Security or other federal agents and concerned about your immigrant status or anything like that. Well, since that ordinance has been put in place years ago, it's a little bit of a different world these days, and there's a lot more concerns, and I'm hearing a lot of concerns from people and more stories about people who are arrested and are taken to the county jail and aren't heard from again, or are caught up in deportation hearings and those things for a long time. So I think it's worthwhile looking at our contract that we have with them. The county actually gets a lot of money from the city of Minneapolis to handle all our arrestees. It's significant, and maybe we can have some special requirements put on that contract so that the sheriff can also be compelled to abide by our separation ordinance. So I appreciate your support, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to get on my little high horse here and give a speech.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. And it seems like we have a couple of questions or comments. The first one from Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was wondering, does anybody know when the contract is up and when those negotiations / conversations will begin? And when will we find out whether or not they will accept those terms? Because I'm just curious if ICE is able to preempt the county given the level of government, how would that all fit together, and how would we implement that? So I'm just curious about when we would get more information back from this work.
That's a good question. Do you want to take a first stab at it, and then I can share what I understood from our meeting, or I can just share.
Maybe you can talk about the timeline a little. I do know that the contract can be amended at any time as long as both parties agree, and I think it's automatically renewed if we don't decide to terminate it. So it's not like we're waiting for an opportunity to make an amendment. When we're ready, we can propose it, but we have to get a recommendation, I think, from the city attorney before then take that to the sheriff and see what he says.
Yes, so I just wanted to respond to the question a little bit too, is so the staff direction today is to kind of begin that process of getting our staff members to get together and identify those clear changes that we want to then bring to the county. The negotiations seem to be a little bit fluid in terms of how those discussions happen. I will say that we've had a request from the sheriff himself to come and present before this committee. And so we are hoping that this information will help us enrich that conversation when it is scheduled to happen. Right now, the sheriff and I are trying to schedule a phone conversation so that we can get clarity about the outcome and the timing of his presentation. As you know, one of the challenges of our committee right now is that we only meet about once a month. And already in the year, December will be taken up by the budget. We have a month where we don't meet. So our time is very limited, but our workload is a lot. And so we really have to figure out a way to schedule these conversations in a more organized way. So we're working with the sheriff's office to get that information and get him queued up to come before the committee. And we will work really hard to make sure that this information is provided to council members before that discussion or presentation happens. We have a comment or question from Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Cano, and thank you, Councilmember Gordon, and especially thank you, Chair Cano, for your leadership on this issue. This is one of the important gaps in the sanctuary city that I know about because of study sessions that you've led, so I really appreciated learning from you and watching you lead on this issue, and I'm happy to support it. I feel a little weird asking this question in this formal setting, but I'm a little concerned, or at least I'm wondering about whether the clause at the end of the staff direction kind of negates it. We're asking to the greatest extent that's consistent with federal law and any other applicable state laws, and it feels a little bit like this is a resistance to federal law, that in fact we're putting ourselves a little bit in conflict with at least some federal direction, and that's our intention, and then that's representative of our values as a city to the extent that they're in conflict. So I guess I'm wondering, does this produce something meaningful with that clause at the end? Is that something that we're comfortable with as a part of the staff direction, recognizing that it's an awkward thing to vote in a public way to explicitly put ourselves in contradiction to federal law?
Excellent question, Councilmember Fletcher. And did you want to talk before the city attorneys? So why don't we go ahead with Councilmember Gordon, and then we have the city attorney's office wants to say something.
Okay, I just do want to note that we did some research into what Chair Stanek has laid out as his process, and we were reassured that there are parts of it that are not, he's not required to do by federal law, and I think the staff direction was crafted with the help from the city attorney's office, and I think that maybe they wanted some clarity that we weren't going to be asking them, but I'll let the city attorney speak for that. But clearly, we think there are some things we could ask for that would be certainly within his authority to put into the contract that wouldn't violate any laws.
Madam Chair and committee members, Joel Fussy from the City Attorney's Office, and although I have not personally worked on this issue, I was briefed on it by Mr. Nilsson earlier, and Councilmember Gordon is correct. Our office has vetted this language, and I believe that our office feels confident that we'll be able to achieve the ends that we're looking for with this sort of language, and would recommend that it be adopted as is.
Just wanted to add that the city of Ramsey County, I believe, has what I have been told is a shining example of the reduction of number of undocumented immigrants that have been able to be protected through the changes that their sheriff's office has led on this very topic. And so we do have a sister county that we can glean information from and see how we can align it with our intent and our efforts. So there's other folks looking at this, and certainly if you as council members bump into any information on this topic, let us know so it can inform the effort moving forward. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Cano. Councilmember Gordon, can you just please restate what the intention is, or what the outcome we hope to achieve?
Yes, I think the bigger outcome would be greater protection for more residents of Minneapolis who wouldn't have to be fearful of consequences if they or one of their loved ones got arrested for some reason, in terms of it getting them all wrapped up in a larger process. The shorter kind of outcome I'm looking for is maybe an improved contract that made it really clear, and some expectations about what kind of support and services arrestees from Minneapolis police officers might get, what kind of communication would or wouldn't happen with ICE or other entities. So we improve that contract. I was a little bit intrigued hearing that Ramsey County has a different approach, though, and I wouldn't be adverse to saying perhaps there's someone else who can provide us these services better than Hennepin County that we like. And then there was a day when Minneapolis did some of its own detentions. I mean, that would be a big step to take. But so exploring alternatives, but with that greater end in mind of trying to protect more of our residents from getting caught up in this whole process.
Okay, sounds like that is it for questions. And so on the motion to approve the staff direction to direct our city coordinator's office and MPD and city attorney's office to come up with contract amendments to the Hennepin County jail contract, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? This motion moves forward. And without further business before our committee, we are adjourned. Thank you.